Raised panels start by making glued up panels, which means stock prep. I'm not going to show all the processes of turning stock into S4S material, but fundamentally, it's a function of getting your jointed edges perfect so you can do good glue ups. There's nothing magical about these glue ups, other than I want to try to get the grain and color matches as close as possible. These doors are going to be used inside in a kitchen. I want to be careful with my stock selection. With walnut in particular, especially flat sawn walnut, I don't want to use air dried stock. In the past, when I've done that, even if the wood has been dried a long time, the relative changes in temperature and humidity can cause warping of the doors. So in this case, I'm using kiln dried walnut. Also, generally speaking, if you can use quarter sawn material, it's more stable than flat sawn material. For walnut, quarter sawn doesn't look quite right, so I'm going with flat sawn, but kiln dried. At this point, the panels are still 20 millimeters thick rather than the final thickness of 19 millimeters, giving me a millimeter to play with at the wide belt to remove all the glue marks and flatten everything and make sure they're ready to go. When I take the panels out of the clamps, I scrape off as much glue as I can and I rough size them to run through the wide belt. They come off the wide belt having been sanded to 120 grit and are now exactly 19 millimeters, ready to cut to final size. The crosscut fence on my Martin slider is slightly different than many in that it's a 2-point fence. There's only 2 points of contact with the wood, which is great for solid wood work because what it lets you do is deal with a board that might have a slight bow or twist in it but still accurately register it for length. I prefer this to a consistent fence where the wood rocks against a solid piece of aluminum the whole length. The airtight clamps really help in this process, making things a lot safer and a lot faster. Anytime you make a door or panel where the center is made of solid stock, whether it's flat or raised, you have to accommodate for movement. In my case, with the cope and stick frame, I'm using space balls or barrel spacers, and I'm allowing 5 millimeter per spacer for a total of 10 millimeters in both length and width to allow the panel to move. The spacer barrels are slightly bigger than 5 millimeters, so that after assembly, the center panel will compress the barrels just a hair. The panels will float nicely, supported and centered by the barrels in the cope and stick grooves. I'll illustrate this more clearly in the next video where I actually show assembly of these 5-part doors. At this stage, all the panels are ready to go. They're sized to the correct thickness and exactly the right width and height. I set up the shaper first to do the back cut, the relief cut. In my case, my 19 millimeter thick panels equate to 19 millimeter thick on the cope and stick rails and stiles. So the front of the panels will be flush to the front of the doors and the back of the panels will be flush to the backs. The groove in the rails and stiles starts 3 millimeters from the back of each part. So therefore, that relief cut needs to be 3 millimeters. Luckily, my shaper makes this setting easy once I programmed in this specific cutter. My freeborn back cutter is relatively small in diameter, which means that the spindle, along with all of the spacers on the spindle, are fairly far forward, and I can't use the fingers on the iron fence to give me a straight plane across both fences. So I make a sacrificial fence out of 1/8 inch or 3mm Baltic birch, and I use that to support the stock as I run for the back cuts. The shaper is now configured to do the back cuts. I swivel the feeder into place, aimed toward my sacrificial fence, and start. I always start with the end grain of the panel first. This allows any tear out that happens with the end grain to be cleaned up on the passes with the grain down the edges. And like so much of woodworking, now it's just monotony, feeding the wood in piece by piece, part by part. Experience has taught me to do the back cutting before I do the panel raising. The panel raising removes so much material that when I do that first and then try to do the back cut, the wheels of the feeder don't get enough purchase on a flat surface, but rather have to contend with the ramps caused by the large panel cutting. Finally, we're ready to set up to do the panel raising and start those cuts. I have a number of raised panel sets, but for these doors, I'm going to use the Zuani insert set. We have a couple of profiles for this cutter, and in this case, I need to change them. The key here is to ensure that the sockets that the new knives slip into is incredibly clean. You really don't want that knife anything other than registered firmly against the aluminum body of the cutter. Maybe it's steel. Anyway, it's big and heavy, and I wouldn't want a cutter flying out at me. This cutter will cut the face of the material that's down against the cast iron. So, I need to install the cutter to the correct height to just remove what I need. Now in this case, as you can see, I didn't remove the ring below the cutter, so I have to start over, take the cutter off, and remove the ring, because the cutter's going to have to slip below the surface. I've already programmed for this cutter, so I find the Zuani panel setup and select it, and the shaper will move into position for the cuts. Now, the profile that we need for this cut is very deep. And it's so deep, in fact, that I need the fences, as you see, vaulted all the way back, very close to the spindle. So in this case, I've made a sacrificial fence with a piece of aluminum across the front, which serves as my bearing surface for the tongue of the panel to ride continuously across the fence with no breaks whatsoever. You can see that by using aluminum, I'm able to tuck it right up against the spindle and get the maximum depth of cut. Now I just run a test piece, which is an offcut from cutting the panels, and I grab one of the rails and test the fit to see if I need to adjust the height of the cutter at all to remove any more material. Once we're happy with the fit, now it's just the monotony of once again running the panels one by one. End grain first, as always, so that we can clean up any tear out on the edges with the long grain cuts. We now have all the parts complete for our doors, and the next video will show glue up. Thanks for watching.